Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to add some animations to our player character. Now I have already included some pre-made animations with a pre-made animator over here inside the assets folder, but let's first do it from scratch just so you'll learn how to do it. First, to animate we're going to need the animator component. If we go inside the player visual game object, once again, remember all the visuals go on the visual game object. So for adding the animator component, we want it on the visual and not on the logic component. So anyways, over here, as you can see, by default, I already attached it with the assets included, but let's do it from scratch. So let's remove this by default. Now let's add a new component. Let's call it an animator. Also, one very important thing here. It's the animator component, not the animation component. These two are completely different. The animation component, this one is actually related to Unity's legacy animation system from a very long time ago. It's only here pretty much for backwards compatibility and for super simple use cases. So most of the time, make sure you're using the animator component. Okay, so to drive this animator component, we need an animator controller. Let's go into our project files and let's create a brand new animator controller. Let's call this my player animator. Then let's select the player visual and just drag the controller on there. Okay. Again, if you have issues and you cannot drag the animator onto the field, make sure you're using the animator and not the animation component. Okay, so with this, we have assigned our animator controller. And now let's double click on it to open the animator window. And if you don't see it, then go into window, then go into animation and open up the animator window. And also, if you still don't see anything, then maybe you might have some issues with your layout. If that's the case, then go onto the top right corner layout and go back into the default and then back into your own layout. And finally, if you still don't see anything on this window, if you don't see the default states, make sure you have the object selected in the hierarchy. So with that, you should be able to see these states. So this is our animator controller. Now I have a really detailed overview of the animator and the animation windows in my Ultimate Unity overview course. So you can go watch those lectures for some really in-depth explanations about everything this does. Basically, the animator is a state machine. So you have various states and you can create transitions between each state. By default, you have these three special states. There's the entry state, exit, and any state. These are used for making transitions, but we don't really need to worry about them just for now. First, let's just make a basic new animation. And for that, the easy way to do it is to open up the animation window. So let's go up top into window, go into animation and open up the animation window. So here it is. Again, that's a different window. That's animation, not animator. And for me, for this window, I like to dock it down here. So there's a nice timeline. So I think this is good. Okay. And now if we select the object in the hierarchy that has our animator, then we can see the text here. So to begin animating, we've got a nice button to create an animation. So let's go ahead and click on this. And now let's give it a name. For now, let's first make the idle animation. So let's just call this idle. And yep, just like that, we have created an animation. You can see the animation window down here has changed. We now see a nice timeline showing the time. And also on the animator controller, you can see the new animation was added as a brand new state. So a new state was created. And if you click to select it, on the right side in the inspector, you see the motion, so the actual animation selected. And you can also see that there's an arrow pointing from the entry onto the idle state. So that means this one is going to be the default state. When the animator controller starts, it will start playing right on this state. Let me just point out one more thing related to animations. So on the project window, we can see, yep, here is our animation that we just created. And you can see the inspector looks just like this. Now, if your inspector looks differently, that might be because you accidentally created a legacy animation. That has to do with the previous animation system that I talked about, the one that is legacy that should really no longer be used. So if you see a different inspector, then a quick way to fix it is to click on these three dots on the inspector, these three dots. Then you change the inspector into debug inspector. And over here, you see a toggle for legacy. So for the animations that we want to use right now, we do not want to be using legacy animations, so make sure this one is untoggled. If in your case it's toggled, just untoggle it, then go back into the normal inspector, and now, yep, it should look just like this. Okay, so we have our animation, and now it's on our animator controller. Now let's actually make an animation. So let's select the animation window, and again, let's make sure to select the object, so let's select the player visual game object. So here on the animation window, we see this nice little red button. This one enables or disables recording. So if you click on it, you can see, yep, the timeline is now red, meaning that we are now recording. And now we can do anything to any child objects and it will record any changes we make. Now note what I said, that's very important. It needs to be child objects. If you select, for example, the parent game object, then all of a sudden it stops recording. So you can only animate child objects. So let's select the player visual, let's enable recording, then let's expand the player visual. Let's make sure that our timeline is on 0, so drag it all the way to the left. And now for example, let's grab the head object and let's move it just a tiny bit. Basically just move it enough in order to make sure that the position over here is in red, meaning that we have recorded a keyframe. Then let's drag the timeline by a little bit. Let's go over here to frame 30. this one is actually going to be half a second. And it's going to be that because over here on the samples, this is the frame rate for the animation. So at 60, that means we have 60 frames. This makes 1 second. So 30 frames would be half a second. You can also zoom out by scrolling over here or dragging the handles down here. So let's go into 30, half a second. And on this one, let's move the head by a little bit, something like this. As you can see down there, we can note that it recorded the new keyframe. And now if we hit on the play button, we can preview the animation. And yep, look at that. It does do exactly that. So it starts off down and then moves up. Okay, so that's great, but we don't want it to snap back. So let's actually add another keyframe right at the end. So let's stop playing the animation. And to make sure we have a perfect loop, let's just click to select the keyframe. Let's press Ctrl C. Then let's go down into the 1 second mark. Let's press Ctrl V, and there we go, there's the exact same keyframe. So now if we hit on play, yep, there we go, we have our nice seamless loop. So the head goes up and down and repeats forever. All right, awesome. Okay, so that's great. Now let's also do one thing. Let's also record a keyframe on the body. However, we don't want it to move, at least not in this idle animation. We just want to have a static keyframe. So let's select the body. And let me actually move it a bit to the side just to make sure to record. And now manually, we can modify the things over here to modify the actual keyframe data. So on this one, I don't want it to move. So let's put it all the way back at 0. Just to make sure we have a nice keyframe recording. Now, the reason why we are recording the body position even without moving it is because the wonk animation will indeed move the body. But when we get back to idle, we want the body to go back to this exact position. So that is why we need a keyframe here. Okay, so that's done. So we can stop recording. So let's click on the red button again. Okay, great. By the way, one more note to make sure that the animation loops, go into the project window and over here select the animation and make sure loop time is enabled. It should be there by default. Okay, so the animation is set up, and if we look in the animator, it's already the default state. So if we hit play, we should be able to see the idle animation playing nonstop. So let's hit play, and yep, there it is, the idle animation with the head moving up and down. Everything works perfectly. All right, awesome. Okay, so next up, let's make a wonk animation. Now for me, when making an animation that is based on another one, I like to actually duplicate it instead of starting from scratch. So over here on the project window, let's select the idle animation, and let's duplicate it, so Ctrl D. Let's rename this one to the wonk animation. And now if we select the player visual and then we go into the animation window, over here we see a nice little drop down menu for all of the animations, except right now we don't see the wonk animation, we only see the idle animation. That is because this menu only shows animations that are attached to the animator. So first we need to add the animation onto the animator component, and how we do that is actually super simple. Let's just open up the project window and just drag the wonk animation and drop it here. That's it. So with this we have attached a new state to the animator controller, and now if once again we select the object in the hierarchy, go into the animation, click the drop down menu, and yep, now we do see the wonk animation. So let's click to select this one, and now for this one let's make the animation. So let's look in scene view and make it bounce just up and down. So I'm going to enable record, go back here, and for the body this one already has a keyframe, so let's go up here, move it a little bit, and then copy the keyframe, put it the same one at the end, something like this. So there you go, just goes up and down. Let's actually put it offset so it looks a bit better, so something like this. By the way, in a bit we're going to replace these animations with the ones that I made previously, so don't worry about making the animations perfect unless you want to do that. Okay, so there you go, that's the animation, although for walking it should be much faster. So here's a quick animated tip. This top bar here lets you select all of the keyframes within a certain time. So if I click to select, note how it selects both those keyframes. And also if you click and drag whilst on top of here, you can select multiple keyframes. So for example, to select everything, just click and drag to select all of them. And now you see these nice little vertical bars. So if you click on those and then you drag them, you can basically modify the time of all the animations and everything matches up. So for example, let's make this one super fast. Let's put it just 20 frames. So there you go. Now it's a much faster wonk animation. Okay, great. Let's click on the right to stop recording. All right, and back in the animator. So over here we have both animations. And now what we need is to make a transition going from idle into wonk. Otherwise the wonk animation will never play. So how we make a transition is also super simple. Let's right click on the idle state. Let's make a transition. Then now we have a nice little arrow under the mouse. And now if we go into the wonk and click on it, there you go, we have a nice transition. Now we can click on the transition itself to select it. And over here in the inspector, we see a bunch of transition options. So let's expand the settings. Yep, there you go, everything. Now, like I said, I covered all of these options in a lot of detail in my Ultimate Unity Overview course. So if you want to learn more, go watch that. Here, let's just learn the basics for how to achieve our goal in making a simple player animator. The important one is over here, the exit time. Basically, if this one is toggled, then this transition will be triggered automatically, meaning it will play the idle animation and immediately transition into the wonk animation. So for example, if we hit play and look at it quickly, yep, there you go, there's the idle, and yep, transitions into wonk. And now it stays there forever. Okay, so that's good, but not exactly what we want. we want the walk animation to only play when the character is walking, and when it stops, we want it to go back into the idle animation. Now for that, we need to use animator parameters. So back in our animator, on the top left corner, we see something called layers. We don't need to worry about that for now. And then next to it, we see parameters. Then we can click on the plus button in order to create a brand new parameter, and you can see all of the various types that we can create. Now for walking, we want something that we can set to either true or false. So let's go with a nice boolean. And for name, let's call it is walking. Again, pay very close attention to the capitalization. This is extremely important. Just like code, is walking is different from is walking. So make sure the capitalization is perfect. Okay, so with that, we have our nice parameter. Now let's click on transition going from idle into walk. And now let's untick exit time. We don't want this transition to trigger automatically. And as soon as we do, we see this nice little warning. Basically, it's telling us that this transition will never happen. So over here, we have the nice conditions. If we click on the plus icon, we can add some conditions. And for this one, we want this transition to happen from idling to walk when the parameter is walking is set to true. So that's it. This is our transition. Now let's just do the reverse. So let's right click on the walk, make transition, go back into idle. Let's click to select transition, get rid of the exit time and conditions when is walking is set to false. Okay, so just like this, our basic animation logic should be working. So let's test. So here we are, and the character is playing the idle animation. By the way, you can look at the animator while the game is running. So let me just drag the animator window, just drag it and put it on the side of the game view so we can see both at the same time. Okay, great. And right now, note how it's not updating, so there's nothing moving over here on the animator component. That is because, like I said, you must select the object. So on the hierarchy, make sure you select the player visual, and yep, there you go. Now you do see that updating. So make sure the object is selected in the hierarchy. And over here, we see a nice little progress bar showing the idle animation constantly playing and looping. Okay, great. Another important thing is over here the parameters. You can manually change the state of these while the game is running. So for example, if I click, it's going to trigger the is walking parameter, which should trigger this transition and should go into walk. So if I click, and if there you go, transitions into the walk animation, and now, yep, it is playing the walking animation. And if I click to untick it, look at over there what happens, untick, and there you go, transitions back into idle. All right, awesome. So as you can see, we have all of our logic working. We have the animator with both of our states, and by changing this parameter, we can change which animation is playing. Now, of course, the goal is not to trigger this manually by clicking on it, but rather doing it through code. But at least for now, we know that our animator is fully set up. Again, if you want more detail on the animator and animation windows and everything related to animations, then check out those lectures in my Ultimate TNT overview course. And also later on, for more advanced use cases, I have a video on the animation rigging package. This one is for more advanced use cases for making dynamic procedural animations. It's really fun, so definitely check it out, but only after finishing this course. That one is a much more advanced tool. For now, let's continue here. So we want to trigger our parameter, but do it through code. And again, here we have yet another clean code question. Technically, we could add that code directly over here on the player script. We could just grab the animator component and change the parameter. And in this case, for this very simple game, that would actually not necessarily be a very bad approach, since the game is so simple with so few animations. But like I said, I want to teach you proper good practices, so let's make it properly and actually separate the animations from the logic. For that, let's go into our project, right click in our scripts folder, create a new C# script. Let's call it the player animator. Let's select the player visual game object and attach the component. Okay, so now here, first let's grab the animator. Now one approach is, like we've seen, we could just make a serialized field and drag the reference in the editor. That's one approach. Or alternatively, since the animator is attached to the same game object as this script, then we can just do a get component. Both approaches are really valid. So here let's use get component just to see a different approach. So we just have a field for our animator, so animator. And then we just do a private void awake. And then awake lets you get component of type animator. And we set our animator variable. Again, like I mentioned, very important, make sure you don't mix animator and animation. These are two different components. We want the animator. Okay, so with this, we have a reference to our animator component. And now how we modify the parameter is actually very simple. We just access the animator, and then we have a bunch of set functions. You can see we have one for each type. So we've got a set bool, set float, then down here a set trigger, set vector. So function to set any parameter type. Now we made it a boolean, so let's use the set bool. And this one, as you can see, takes the name for the animator parameter. By the way, strings are a horrible way of identifying things, but sadly this system really does require strings to identify the parameter we want to change. If you're wondering why strings are bad for identifying things, the reason is because it's very easy to make a mistake. For example, if you use is wonking here, then this will work. However, if you instead write is wonking, then all of a sudden does not work. If you write is wonking like this, doesn't work, like this, doesn't work. And even though it doesn't work, it will also not throw any compiler errors. That is because for the compiler, a string is a string, it's always valid. But then when the code runs, this one is going to be different than our parameter, which is named example like this. Always remember that strings are case sensitive. So that's one reason why you should never use strings to identify things. It's very, very easy to make tons of mistakes that are then very difficult to find out. But like I said, in this animated system, we have to use strings. There's no other way. In order to minimize our usage of strings, one thing we can do is, for example, let's define a constant up here. So let's make a private, make it const for a constant, meaning this will never change. Make it of type string and call it is wonking. Again, refer back into the naming rules section. For constants, we always use uppercase, snake case. So is wonking, and let's set it with is wonking. Again, make sure you don't make a mistake here. Make sure you type it exactly like you did on the animator. Then down here, let's use is wonky. And now if we do make a mistake, so if we accidentally use something different, now we do get a compiler error, so at least we have a little bit of protection. Okay, so this one takes a string for the name and then a simple boolean for the value. So this is going to be the value that we want to set to our parameter. Now for this one, we want it to set to true when the player is wonking and false when it's not. So for that, we need to ask the player what it's doing. So let's go over here into our player class. And let's make a function to return just that. So let's make it public because we're going to access it from another script. We're going to return a bool and call it is wonking. Now over here, we just need to return if the player is wonking. So let's make a local field to store that state. So over here, private bool is wonking. Again, note the capitalization. For fields, we start with camel case, whereas for functions, we have Pascal case. So these are different, okay? So basically, in order to define if we are wonking, that's very simple. It's just down here we have the movement direction. So we are wonking if the move direction is different from vector 3.0, which by the way, vector 3.0 is just a shorthand for writing 0, 0, 0. So if the movement direction is different from 0, then we are indeed wonking. So we define that, we update that field on every update, and then over here we just return it, okay, just like this. And now back in our player animated component, over here first we need a reference to the player. So let's add it here. Let's add a serialized field of type player. And we need to compile this in order to drag the reference. So let's just comment out this line just to make sure the code compiles. Now here with the code compile, let's drag the reference of our player. Okay, that's it. And then over here for the animator, set is wonking. Let's go into the player and let's ask is wonking. And of course, we don't want to do this just on awake. We want to do it on every single frame. So let's do a private void update. And on update, let's do this. All right, that's it. So this should be working. Let's test. So here we are starting off as idle, and now as I move, yep, there you go, it is playing the wonking animation. And now if I stop, and yep, there you go, back into idle. All right, awesome, everything does work perfectly. Okay, great. We can even look at the animator to see the state change. So here with both side by side and with the object selected in the hierarchy, right now you can see is wonking is false, so it's on idle. And as I move, that one stays true, that one goes into wonk. And now if I let go, if there you go, back into false, back into idle. All right, awesome. So with this, everything is working perfectly. If you're having issues, make sure you pay attention to the capitalization. So make sure the name you wrote here is exactly the same one that you wrote here, and it's exactly the same that you're using here. All right, so all of our animations are working perfectly. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and make your own animations, or you can use the ones that I pre-built. So in the included project files, inside the assets here, we've got the animations, and we've got the player with the idle and the wonk animations. If we double click on this to look at it, you can see, yep, it looks exactly the same. So there's a parameter called is wonking and our transition, so everything is exactly the same. Just over here, let's select the player visual, and on the prefab, like we saw, we already had the animated component. We just removed that one from the prefab in order to build it all from scratch. But if you want to use my animations, then we can just go ahead, remove the animator that we added, and then right click on this one on the remove component. Let's revert back the changes. And there you go. Here we have our animator with the player controller. So that's the one in the included animations. And just like this, if we had on play, and actually over here I found an issue, although in your case there shouldn't be any issue because I have updated the assets. But this is a good time to teach you about any issues with animations. So if you select the animation and you select the animation, then over here you might see some of them in yellow saying missing. Basically the way that animations work is based on the actual name of the object. If it cannot find an object with the exact same name, then it cannot load the same animation. So my problem is that when I initially made the assets package, I made this animation and the object was previously named face, and then I renamed it to head, so now it no longer loads. So if you ever have problems with loading animations, just make sure the names perfectly match. So in my case, I can just click in here in order to rename this keyframe on the animation, and I'm just going to use the name that I renamed it. so head, and just like this, yep, the animation does play correctly. So just a nice quick tip, if you ever have problems with animations, always remember that the stored keyframes, they're all stored based on name. So if you rename the thing in here or over here on the game object, if you rename, you're going to have missing animations, but if you make sure the names match, then the animation should load perfectly. So let's hit on play, and if there you go, there's the idle animation, and if I move, yep, there's the nice wonk animation. So everything still works perfectly because it's only using the exact same parameters. Alright, awesome. So like I said, if you want, feel free to make your own animations or use the ones that I've included. For me, I'm going to be using these ones. So the ones that we made just for learning, which I created down here, so the My Player Animator and these animations, I'm just going to delete these just to keep the project clean. So just delete, and just like that. Okay, so now that we have our character fully working, let's quickly handle our camera.